Hello and welcome to our fourth and final installment of Women in the Bible. This week, we are looking at the story of Bathsheba, and you may know about her, you may not. But specifically this week, what we're going to transition into doing is looking at how women are portrayed in the story when it is told by men. So the last few weeks, we've been given the narrative straight from the woman, from Ruth, from Naomi, from Hagar and Sarah and Deborah. But Bathsheba's story is mostly told by King David. So let's get into it. There are a lot of texts where she is mentioned in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2. So I'm going to give a broad overview of them. I want to start first by looking at King David's family line real quick. You'll notice King David in the center here with the crown. A couple generations back is his great-grandmother Ruth, who we talked about last week. And then we can see there's a whole lot of family drama going on here. David has a lot of wives, and Bathsheba is one of his wives, who ultimately gives birth to Solomon, who becomes the third king of Israel. A little bit of an overview for 2 Samuel chapter 11. King David's army is at war, but he is in Jerusalem. We're not really sure why. King David spots Bathsheba bathing on the roof after her time of the month and cleaning herself, purifying herself in a natural way down on the roof with the heat of the sun to warm the water. David says, "Who is this woman? I like her," calls her to the palace, sleeps with her, and she gets pregnant. Here, there's a lot of ambiguity in the story. Did David know her or not? Jerusalem was a very small city. And Bathsheba's husband Uriah was a member of King David's army. So likely David knew who she was. Was this consensual or not? We don't know. And there's no good way to know that. But keep these questions and uncertainties in mind as we go forward. We're going to talk about issues of interpretation later. The story continues, and David tries to cover up his actions. He calls Uriah home from war. He tries to get him to go home and sleep with his wife. But traditionally at that time, soldiers were not to enjoy the comforts of home or their spouse while they were in battle. And so Uriah denies and basically says, well, no, I'm not allowed to, so I'm not going to. Ultimately, that gets Uriah killed. The next time we see Bathsheba, she is grieving. She's grieving for her husband. She's now pregnant. Her whole life has been turned upside down. After the period of mourning, she becomes David's wife, and they have a son. The prophet Nathan comes to David in 2 Samuel chapter 12. He tells a parable and he says, "Yeah, you're not good. God is not happy with you. You have broken 3 of the 10 commandments in way too short of a time. You are guilty of coveting, adultery, and murder, all within that same household with Bathsheba and her husband Uriah." He proclaims that a message of destruction will come from within his house. We'll see how that plays out, but what we won't see is later in 2 Samuel, David's older children all get into this mixing of issues. David's daughter Tamar is raped by his son Amnon, who is then killed by his other son Absalom, who is then killed for trying to revolt against David. So that's kind of some of the first workings of Nathan's warning, God's not happy and this is not going to be good for you. King David also knows that his child with Bathsheba is going to die, and so he mourns. He asks God not to do this. He says, "Don't let my child die." And unfortunately, the child dies. David then takes off his mourning clothes. He gets back to work, and Bathsheba then later gives birth to Solomon. And then we hear at the end of the chapter that David has won the war. Then so King David's story continues in 2 Samuel, but we're going to jump to 1 Kings, in which we see King David as old and on his deathbed. And at this point, he has not technically named a successor. Now, his oldest surviving son at this time, so the other ones have done their deed and they've died. And so his oldest now is Adoniah. And Adoniah says, well, of course it's going to be me. And so he starts making preparations to name himself king. The prophet Nathan goes to Bathsheba and says, hey, this is not going to be good for you if Adoniah is king. Solomon is David's favorite son. So here's what we're going to do. So they plot, they figure out how to go to King David. And Bathsheba goes to King David and she says, please name Solomon as your next king. He is your beloved, and this is the right thing to do. So King David agrees. He sets forth preparations. Solomon is named king, and his reign begins soon after when David dies. In chapter 2, we see that Adoniah comes back, furious and angry, rightfully so, and he is plotting to take the throne from Solomon. He goes to Bathsheba and he says, I would like Abishag to be my wife. Go talk to Solomon and get him to give me her as a wife. Now, Abishag was a concubine of King David. She was brought to him in his old age, so she's probably younger, very favorable. Bathsheba, in her status as queen mother, goes to Solomon. She's given a place at his right hand. All of the fancies are brought out. She says, here's what your brother Adoniah has requested. King Solomon sees through this request. He says, I know that if Adoniah is given my father's concubine as a wife, that gives him claim to the throne. So he is secretly trying to steal my throne. So what does he do? He eliminates the problem, and there goes Adoniah. The next time we see Bathsheba she's mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 when David's family tree is outlined. We also see her again in Matthew 1 when Jesus's family tree is outlined. I've talked before about how wonderful it is that Matthew includes women in the lineage that is so often following the patriarchy and the patriarchal line. But we can see Boaz is named, who then marries Ruth and has Obed. We also see Solomon by Bathsheba is named, and the connections all the way down to Jesus, born of Mary. It's always fun to see the ways that the lineage and the stories have been traced and connect to one another. So a little bit about Bathsheba. She starts out the story as a wife. We don't know how old she is. We don't hear that she has any children, so maybe they're newlyweds, and her husband has gone off to war. We then find out that she has some relations with David, and that ends up with her as a widow. So we see her grieving for her husband. Then she is made a wife again and brought to King David, where she then has her first child. Later, she will then go on to have more children. But at the hands of King David, Bathsheba suffers a lot of trauma. We don't know whether or not their relations were consensual or not, but if she was raped, that's a trauma in itself. If we know that King David killed her husband, which is also traumatic, she may not know that it was intentional, but she might suspect it. So Bathsheba she is a survivor at this point in the story. By the time she becomes David's wife, she is a survivor of great trauma and acts that are they're not okay. Bathsheba is the woman who speaks the most in the book of Kings. We only see 3 words in 2 Samuel when she tells King David, I am pregnant. But in the book of Kings, she says 189 words going back and forth with Nathan and with King David and with Solomon, really kind of being this mediator between all of the men and what's going on here. An important thing about her story is that we have no record of her emotions. Because it is from the perspective of King David, we have no idea what's going on. We don't know how she feels when she's grieving. Is she grieving because her husband died and she's really sad? Is she grieving because she knows King David did it? There's so much missing information, and her emotions, which are really important to understanding a story, they're gone. We do, however, know by closely looking at the story and reading into it and using the text notes and historical understanding that Bathsheba was the favored wife. She was also a court presence. She was an advisor, a diplomat, and she was the queen mother. So when we read into the story and look at the meaning behind the text, we can see that she was really, really important. We do have another woman in this story, and we really don't get much about her because she never speaks. Abishag is brought into the story, and she's used by men for their own personal gain. So if you're reading in 1 Kings, you'll see her first appear. She is brought to King David to be his nurse and concubine on his deathbed. She is there to totally take care of him and give herself to him in whatever way possible. We then see later Adoniah use her as a plot to overthrow Solomon. He says, I know that if I marry her, and because my dad was on his deathbed, I know she's still good. Like, he didn't take too much advantage of her. She would make a great wife, give me claim to the throne, it's going to be awesome. So Abishag's main presence in this story is in the way that she's used by men, which is really, really gross. It's really not okay. She was probably young. We have no knowledge of how old she is. We do know she was sought out for her beauty. And since Adoniah wants her as his wife, we can imagine that she would be young and beautiful. And one thing that I found really interesting in reading was that Abishag can also be considered the angel of death. The 2 men that try to get close to her are both killed. King David does die of natural causes, but she is brought to him in that last hour. She's not able to help him regain any strength and show that he is fit to be king. And Adoniah, in trying to use her for a plot against Solomon, ends up dying. So it's just kind of funny to see the little ways. And again, we don't know nearly anything about her. And we don't know where she goes in the story after this, but she's probably under the protection of Bathsheba. Another thing, Abishag was more than likely present when Bathsheba went to King David and said, make Solomon your king. And so she would have been an important witness if anyone had contested what was said. So we get very little, but she's still really important. So I want to take some time to talk about some issues in interpretation. Said it multiple times. We have no emotions of Bathsheba. We have no thoughts from her. The story is entirely from King David's perspective. And that can really skew the way that we are interpreting the story. It can make it really harmful if we're seeing everything as negative. It can also be really helpful if we're able to redeem the story and find better ways of interpreting it. So to start with, the story begins, how did King David actually see Bathsheba bathing? We know she was on the roof. That was totally normal. A traditional interpretation might have said that she was being intentional, putting herself out there. And some other interpretations, also visible in artwork, which is why it's really important to see how art depicts stories, kind of they end up painting David as snooping or spying. Likely, if he had seen someone bathing, it would have been more appropriate for him to look away. But he knew what he was doing. He was intentionally watching her. So was he looking for her? Was it on David? Was it on Bathsheba? We don't know. And I don't know any of these answers, and I hope that you can take, these thoughts and wrestle with them as you read the story yourself. And not just the story of Bathsheba, but all the stories in the Bible, especially the ones about women. Another question, how did King David get Bathsheba? It's often painted as a love story. The king calls on you, you go to his palace, you become his wife. But was it consensual? We don't know. We never will know. Often the story is told as that David raped her. But could there have been some relationship between them that we don't know about? Who knows? It's also important to think about, who can we praise and who can we blame? Bathsheba's actions with King David are neither praiseworthy or blameworthy. She was simply doing what was expected of her. Her king called on her, and she had to respond. This gets at some power dynamics that we see in this story especially, but in every story, between the king and the people. The king calls you to do something. You can't really say no. I mean, Uriah said no and he got killed. That happened in the beginning of the story. So if King David had called on Bathsheba and she said no, she might have died. So this is why it's important to look at all of these different dynamics at play. Moving along in the story, the focus is totally on David. So David and Bathsheba do whatever they do, find out Bathsheba's pregnant. And the story is totally focused on David trying to get Uriah to go home. He doesn't, then he kills Uriah. We don't hear anything about Bathsheba again until we hear that Uriah's wife is mourning. She's not even called her name. And something to think about, there's a lot of missing information, but she could have been trapped by David's actions. She was a widow who was pregnant from an adulterous relationship. There is no way that is her husband's child. Who would marry her for that? In these times, that would have been a great problem. So maybe Bathsheba was trapped by the actions of David. Her only option was to go to King David. We don't know. What's also interesting is what is she doing and what is going on during her pregnancy, during the birth, the life, and the death of her child. We don't see any of that. We just know that she's a wife of David and that David is mourning. We get nothing from her perspective. One thing that's also really important is that this text does not support negative portrayals of Bathsheba. It offers no judgment towards her, and it does not hold her responsible for anything. It's really important to think about. The focus is on David. His actions are the ones intended to be punished. He is the one who has committed the crime. He's the one who's broken the commandments. And yet, at the same time, Bathsheba is also punished. Maybe not intentionally, but because of the actions. So once again, King David is causing more trauma for her. This is also really important. How can we look at this story? And it's something that I have been wrestling with. And it's something that we see in all of the stories, that women are secondhand recipients of the trauma and the abuse from men. Bathsheba's story is no different. Continuing in her story, we can look at, was her actions with the prophet Nathan, where is it guileful intervention, Or was it practical planning? Were they being sneaky and trying to say, well, we just want to get Solomon on the throne? Or were they strategic? I mean, they had reason to believe that if Adoniah was on the throne, harm and destruction and death would come to them. Traditionally, interpreters may have seen this action as being sneaky and cunning. But is it? In this story, we see Bathsheba's power and status, her intelligence and respect all at play. She goes to King David and she asks, and he listens. If she didn't have any status or intelligence or respect, he might have just said, get out of my room. And lastly, in the story, why did Adoniah go to Bathsheba to carry out his plot? Why couldn't he go to Solomon himself? Why did he need to use her? Traditionally, people have thought that Bathsheba didn't know what Solomon was asking, and that Solomon might have listened to his mother and not seen Adoniah's plan beneath the surface. But the reality is that Bathsheba was the queen mother. And we've said that she had power and intelligence and respect. She was part of the court. She probably knew what was going on. And in a sense, she looked to David and she was like, here's what your brother is asking me. Maybe you should eliminate the problem before he finds a way to succeed. This is the second time Adoniah has tried to take the throne. The first while David was alive. Now he's asking for your father's, concubine as his wife. What is he going to do next? All of this changes how we view the story. And I find it really fun to play with these interpretations and to challenge the traditional ones that maybe paint women as not so intelligent and wonderful. I like to think that Bathsheba knew exactly what Adoniah was saying and asking. And for me, that totally changes the story. A quote from one of the books that I've been using, All of the Women in the Bible by Edith Deen. She says, only an intelligent, respected woman in whom the aged king had great confidence could have won so great a victory. Only a righteous woman could have been sought out by the prophet Nathan. Only a much-loved mother could have been so warmly greeted and given the place of honor as queen mother on Solomon's right side, a place of power and authority. Bathsheba's story, seemingly so small and insignificant, here she is painted for her intelligence, her respect, having great confidence and being righteous, that she was much loved and given a place of honor and power and authority. She was not meek and mild. She was bold and powerful. A few lessons from Bathsheba. Power dynamics are always present in a relationship, and how we handle them is critical. Keeping our eyes open for them, not only in the Bible, but in our own lives. These power dynamics are why we have things such as gender-based violence and sexual assault. We see this in Bathsheba's story, but we also see it in the world around us. Another thing that's important is that when women are mentioned but not given the space to tell their story, the story can be filled with both positive and negative views. We see this in the issues of interpretation of Bathsheba's story, but I think that we've also seen it in the world with the Me Too movement, where women are trying to tell their story, but not being given the space, and instead are being ridiculed, and people are filling in the gaps instead of listening to what really happened. And lastly, at first glance, her story is short and seemingly insignificant, but further reading of Bathsheba shows just how important she is. This story could not have happened without her. The lineage of King David to Solomon and ultimately to Jesus might not have happened. So she's really important and she's really awesome. In closing, The narrative focuses on King David, and that leaves us wondering about Bathsheba's thoughts and her actions. As we've said, it leaves ample room for helpful and hurtful interpretations, both good and bad. And that in itself can be good and bad. But the reality is that this is the norm for women's stories in the Bible. This is the last woman that we'll be studying together. But there are so many stories. Not all of them are Ruth, who have their own book. But there are often women who are just named in the story and then not talked about again. But there's so much that we can learn about them when we listen, when we read, and we reread. Reading these stories, talking about them out loud, it allows us to see power differential and sexual relations in regards to the stories of women. And it allows us to talk about these life-giving characteristics that they all embody, but that are covered up unless you read deeper into the story. So as we go forward and as we continue in our study of women in the Bible, I challenge you to read these stories in a life-giving way, to challenge yourself as you read them, to challenge others, and to engage this story with one another. Women in the Bible are so important, and they can really change the way that we understand our biblical history. Thank you for joining me on this journey. It has been absolutely wonderful, and I hope that you have learned something throughout the process. God bless, and I hope to see you soon.